how I think peace is related to the shared societies agenda, describing what I mean by the term peace, and then give a bit of an overview of this idea of violence containment, which is what my paper was on. Then I'll go through a bit of the methodology, the results, and sort of how I came up with this number, which is essentially an attempt to try and account for the cost of violence to the US economy in a year. So in terms of what IEP is trying to do, Institute for Economics and Peace, we're really trying to strip peace of its utopian connotations and make it a tangible policy goal. So by doing that, attaching a number sort of helps. So when I say peace, I really mean this term negative peace, which Paul, you mentioned yesterday, Johann Galtung, he's the father of peace and conflict studies. He came up with this term negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is really the absence of violence, or the absence of the fear of violence. Our definition of violence is the World Health Organization definition, which refers to direct violence, physical forms of violence. So that's in contrast to positive peace, which carries with it, I guess, all those sort of normative conceptions about well-being, happiness, belonging, and to give you an idea, I think Galtung, he described it as cooperation for mutual and equal benefit, where individuals and society are in harmony. So that really, I found that interesting when you break that down, because it has a lot of simpatico with the shared societies definition. The two concepts, I think, are kind of similar in the sense that they're multidimensional. So negative peace, or the absence of violence, is similar to the outcomes of the shared societies agenda in terms of the fact it's not represented by any one factor. It's represented in different political, economic, and cultural forms. And I think both factors, really are similar in the sense of how they link to trust. And I think it's probably self-evident to many that a society that's composed of individuals living in an objective, subjective state of fear aren't going to make good democratic citizens. And hence this quote that I've taken from a book on security, that fearful and anxious environments facilitate behaviours where individuals may become inattentive, unconcerned, or even enthusiasts for the erosion of basic freedoms and lacking sympathy towards others. So I'm trying to sort of see direct violence is very linked to facilitating the kinds of institutions that are associated with the outcomes that the shared society agenda is trying to move towards. So what I'll do just quickly is just map out some really basic empirical relationships between negative peace and some of the outcomes of the shared societies agenda. So I've taken 13 of the indicators from the Global Peace Index. The Global Peace Index is the thing that the Institute is primarily preoccupied with in its work. And these are the internal indicators. So there's 13 of them. I won't go into too much detail because we haven't got time, but essentially those are attempts to be measures of direct violence or negative peace. And the weightings are derived by expert panel. They're not derived by empirical technique. So I just thought, this is one of the benefits of being on the second day, is that I get to sort of moderate my presentation a little bit based on what people were talking about yesterday. And I just thought, because of all the conversation about inequality, just to sort of have a brief discussion. This is just the internal peace score, which the closer to 1 you are, the more peaceful you are, mapped against Gini. And there's a vague relationship there, but it becomes a little bit more interesting when you break it up by levels of economic development. So in the OECD countries, it's a much more I guess, significant factor, even though you've got one outlier there in Chile, and Mexico's in the red. And then, conversely, if you take it to Africa, the relationship is actually the opposite. A little bit of inequality is associated with lower or higher peace. And like you were saying, Guangha, yesterday, is that you sometimes need a little bit of inequality for development. Just to show a quick relationship between negative peace and corruption. So that's just the negative peace score against the world governance indicators. And negative peace against civic activism, which is this composite index put together by the Indices for Social Development, which is all based on survey data. And that's quite an interesting relationship too. So, and incidentally, their other metric of intergroup cohesion is also correlated, although there are some factors that are similar. So it's a bit difficult to disaggregate what's happening there. So this is really just to say that that there's a broad relationship. It's not definitive by any means, obviously, and further research would be good if it could tease out the mechanisms through which violence actually is related to social cohesion, civic activism, and these other factors. So then I thought, just to sort of take this further, is looking at peace at the subnational level within the US. So last year we compiled another index, a composite index of direct violence in the US, and basically that had 5 indicators: incarceration, violent crime, homicide, number of police, and availability of small arms, all very almost evenly weighted. And just correlating that against Robert Putnam's social capital index, which I think he did in 2000, which is based on survey data on number of people in clubs and associations and stuff like that. And it's quite a striking correlation. So the more peaceful states tend to have higher social capital. And that's obviously accounting for the fact that, acknowledging the fact that that social capital can be represented in its positive and negative forms. There are some associations that can be quite negative. I think, Paul, you were saying at lunch yesterday, the Ku Klux Klan is the best example of that. So there can be negative externalities. It's not necessarily a straightforward thing. So now to the point of my paper. And I just wanted to do that just to show the basic relationship between negative peace and the outcomes of shared societies. On this paper, so what I'm trying to do is, by putting a cost on violence, it's just one tangible mechanism for one to be able to see the value of a shared society's agenda. And so what I've done is define this entire category of economic activity as that's related to violence. So the definition is public or private sector economic activity that either inflicts, prevents, responds to, and deals with the consequences of violence. So the things that it includes in the US are things like the defense budget, law enforcement, the corrections budget, the whole plethora of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, homeland security spending, which is very big in the US. All the sort of security around transport, border control, and we've also tried to account for the expenses that households incur in terms of, buying security cameras, locks, and the direct costs of legal, medical costs from assault, and insurance premiums, all the expenses on vandalism from repair and restoration, and private defence exports. So we tried to be comprehensive, and I'll go through a bit of the methodology of how I've done that later. So just some basic, I guess, economics on why violence is important for the economy, and Paul did go over some of the key sort of factors yesterday in his presentation. But the conflict economists often point to the 5 Ds, so destruction, disruption, diversion, displacement, and disincentive. So destruction is pretty obvious. That's what happens when you have a war. You destroy the capital stock. That's obviously not good. Disruption is when trading gets interrupted between voluntary actors, and diversion. The perfect example of that is the transfer of skilled labour from civilian to military purposes. Many people talk about that effect in the US. And displacement and disincentive, which disincentive refers to civilian investment being disincentivized by high levels of violence. So just the theoretical background for this is this peace economics approach, which is, I guess, this nascent area of economic theory. And really, it's really an attempt to try and make a distinction between productive and unproductive forms of production. So the idea is, I guess the theoretical basis, and I've put just a quick quote here from 2 peace economists that we work with, who summarise it as this: the purpose of economic study is premised on the need to understand the design of political, economic, and cultural institutions, their interrelations, and then uncover policies to prevent, mitigate, or resolve any type of latent or actual destructive conflict within and between societies. So the normative element of this is that it's sort of really predicated on the idea that you want to design institutions and policies that help prevent, resolve, and mitigate violence, and to try and sort of facilitate behaviour of peace-creating habits or non-violent habits. So that's the sort of normative element. And I think, it's sort of, in some sense, it's almost self-evident that, a society that, maintains social contract norms that regulate behaviour in a cooperative and mutually beneficial, respectful, trustful way is going to probably have less violence, and by virtue of that have less violence containment spending, so have less of this unproductive money spent on things related to violence. So that's just the economic background. In terms of the methodology of how I came up with this number, what we did was aimed at total expenditures in the 2009-10 financial year. We were only counting direct costs and current expenditures, and so we weren't counting, the indirect costs like, opportunity costs and, the possible flow-on effect multiplier that you might get from, not having a person killed. The lost wages aren't. It's probably a bit crude, but So and I guess the real issue that we had with this is that accounting standards really aren't set up to really count for security line items, at least in the US. So in terms of trying to disaggregate all these lines of expenditure, it's actually really quite difficult. And to do it in a proper value-added way, the only unambiguous line item is really public sector expenditures, because those are the final expenditures in the national income product accounts. So you can count those and say that they're definitely value-added. The private sector costs, which are about 28% of the costs in this, are not sort of indicative figures, I guess, because of that problem. So what we try to do is have line items for each, methodologies for each line item, and that's not in the paper because it's very long and boring. But you can look at it in the final, in a fuller and final version, I guess. So this is the result, and it comes out to 15% of GDP, US GDP, on violence containment, which is quite a big part of the economy. The majority of the expenditure is the public sector expenditure at the top in the light blue. That's about 10.8% of GDP. the majority of that is national defence, or Department of Defence spending, Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, and the debt service on the military-related loans. And that includes CIA, FBI, all the counter-terrorism bodies as well. And then you've got this very big expenditure as well in police, justice, corrections, and other includes local level expenditures. So the kinds of things that local governments do on security, locks and Homeland Security spending on protecting dams and streets and critical sites. Then the private sector spending this is the sort of bit that's a bit more difficult to calculate, and I've sort of made an attempt to sort of break these up into categories. But that overall has a much smaller percentage of the total amount, and we're trying to be conservative in the way that we've done this, so we're not overestimating it. And obviously, it's quite striking when you think about the fact that that size of money is equivalent to $15,000 for each American taxpayer. And I just to put it in perspective, I'm just showing some. I guess the size of if you made violence containment a contiguous industry, it would be bigger than all the other industries at that size. And similarly, 2.16 trillion is a very big amount of money. It's equivalent to, if you take out the US, the 6th largest GDP in the world. So it's a huge cost that the US economy is using on violence. Just to give an idea of the breakdown, so this is the public sector breakdown, and as I say, the majority is this national defence, federal government spending, and this is really the expense that's been growing in the US in the last 10 years. Especially in the areas of Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, and of course, because of the cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, that has been going up significantly. The private sector is broken up into this sort of taxonomy. I categorise the consequences of violence as having the biggest contribution to this amount, and so that includes things like victim, the spending on victim compensation programs, people who have suffered from domestic violence and violent crime, the property loss from arson, healthcare costs for children that have suffered abuse, the medical costs of violent crime and costs of vandalism, etc. So that really has the majority of the private sector expenditure. And then what I tried to do is take this back and sort of look at some kind of trend. And it's very difficult to do this because you'd have to do it properly for the private sector at least, you'd have to attempt to count for each year, which would be incredibly difficult. But if you just isolate that private sector expenditure or forget about it, this is the growth in the public sector violence containment. So this just shows the quite significant increase since 2000. And then just to sort of illustrate, and this is just for illustrative purposes, just to sort of show the sort of direct link between violence and cost, and by proxy, shared societies and cost. This is the map of US Peace Index, so in the darker shades of the less peaceful states. And then we attributed a costing methodology of just the static costs, which was essentially just medical costs from violent crime and homicide, the cost of corrections, the police budgets, judicial spending just related to criminal caseloads. And the most peaceful state, Maine, spends about $250 per person. Middle state like Michigan, is around about 400, and Louisiana is more than double. So that just sort of illustrates that this direct violence can be put into transferred into a figure basically, and a cost attributed. So just in summary, I think this concept probably needs to be, all I've really done is try to account for the number. It's an accounting exercise. I think the next step for this analysis would be to try and investigate how efficient these expenditures are. So it's not to say that spending on security is bad. It's to say what is the most optimal spending on security, and what's the best combination of public and private spending on security. Is there duplication? Is it efficient? And then secondly, I think it's just an important point in summary is that not really acknowledging the opportunity costs and the trade-offs that you are getting when state governments in the US at least, and the federal government is spending this size of money on short-term violence containment. So a lot of these things are just to contain, the basic needs. That money could, obviously be transferred into other productivity-enhancing investments like health, education, and infrastructure. So you do have this trade-off, and there is a vicious cycle. As states spend more on violence containment, it necessitates a reduction of spending in other areas. And the perfect example of that, as many people might know, is California. I think they now spend $47,000 per inmate on corrections, which is the equivalent of a college degree, or the cost of the yearly cost of a law school degree. So and they, at the same time, they can't pay their teachers their wages. So you do have this sort of shift in resources to, violence creates this shift in resources to these unproductive areas of expenditure. So that's really the presentation, and what I did in the paper is try and sort of highlight some fairly crude examples of what you could get with the kind of money that the government is spending on violence containment. They're just there for illustrative purposes. But I guess we can probably move to a discussion.